My husband, Mike, had always been close with his old friend, Rob. They grew up together, and even though their paths diverged, Mike working in construction and Rob becoming a cop, they stayed in touch. Rob was the kind of guy who had a lot of stories, some funny, some intense, and some that made you question why anyone would willingly choose to be a police officer. Last winter, Rob suggested a weekend at a remote cabin. He said it belonged to his cousin and was tucked away deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. Mike thought it would be a good way to relax and catch up, so we packed our bags and drove up to northern Minnesota. It sounded like a peaceful break, and I didn't mind a little adventure. The drive was long, but the scenery was beautiful. Snow blanketed the trees, and the roads were quiet. Rob met us at a gas station near the edge of a small town. He had his truck loaded with supplies, firewood, food, and other essentials. The cabin was about 20 miles further into the woods, accessible only by a narrow dirt road. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was setting. It was a small but sturdy-looking structure, with a steeply pitched roof and a chimney puffing out thin trails of smoke. The cabin had no electricity or running water, just a wood stove and a couple of lanterns. Felt like stepping back in time, but I was okay with it. The first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner over the stove, played cards by lantern light, and listened to Rob's stories. The wind howled outside, but the cabin was warm. Rob told us he liked coming out here because it was so quiet. No traffic, no people, just the sound of the forest. The next morning, we decided to explore the woods. Rob had brought along a couple of rifles, just in case we ran into any wildlife. He said bears were unlikely in the winter, but wolves were a possibility. I wasn't thrilled about that, but Rob seemed confident, so I trusted him. The snow was deep, and the air was biting cold. We trudged through the woods for a couple of hours, following deer tracks and admiring the frozen streams. Rob pointed out some old traps, rusted and abandoned, likely left behind by hunters years ago. When we returned to the cabin, something felt off. The front door was slightly ajar, and there were footprints leading up to it. They weren't ours. Rob's face turned serious, and he motioned for us to stay back while he checked inside. A moment later, he waved us in, saying everything looked fine. We inspected the footprints. They were large, probably a man's, and they circled the cabin before disappearing into the woods. Rob brushed it off, saying it was probably a hunter or a hiker who got curious. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, the wind seemed louder. I thought I heard something outside, a crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. Mike said it was just branches breaking in the wind, but Rob got up and checked outside. He came back quickly and said he didn't see anything, but his expression told me he wasn't so sure. The next morning, we found more footprints. This time, they were closer to the windows. Someone had been looking inside. Rob decided to follow the tracks, so we bundled up and set off into the woods. The tracks led us deeper than we had gone before, winding through trees and over frozen streams. Eventually, we came to a clearing where the tracks stopped. There were no signs of a camp or any other activity, just a bare patch of snow surrounded by trees. Rob crouched down and examined the area. He didn't say anything, but his jaw tightened, and he gripped his rifle a little tighter. We headed back to the cabin, but the atmosphere had changed. Rob seemed on edge, and Mike was unusually quiet. I tried to tell myself it was just some local messing with us, but it was hard to relax. That evening, Rob suggested we keep the fire low and turn off the lanterns to conserve fuel. I think he was trying to make the cabin less noticeable. We sat in the dark, listening to the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin. Every sound outside made me jump. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps crunching in the snow. They were slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Rob motioned for us to stay quiet. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, peeking through a crack in the shutters. He didn't say anything, but his body tensed. After a few minutes, the footsteps faded. We didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, Rob decided we should leave. He didn't elaborate, but I didn't argue. We packed up quickly and loaded everything into the trucks. As we were leaving, I glanced back at the cabin and saw something in the trees. A figure, barely visible through the branches. Rob must have seen it too because he sped up and didn't look back. The drive back to town was silent. We didn't talk about what happened, but I knew we were all thinking the same thing. Whoever or whatever had been out there wasn't just passing through. When we got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Rob never mentioned the trip again, and Mike avoided the subject whenever I brought it up. But sometimes, late at night, I'd wake up and think I heard footsteps outside, and every time, I'd wonder if they had followed us home. It was late November 2021, and I needed a break from everything. Work was draining, my social life was non-existent, and my body screamed for rest. I thought a weekend in a remote cabin would be perfect. No emails, no texts, just peace and quiet. I rented a small, basic cabin in the woods of Montana, far from any neighbors or towns. It was the kind of place where the nearest gas station was a 40-minute drive away, and cell service was a joke. That was part of the appeal. The cabin was old but well-kept, built in the late 70s. It had one bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a wood stove for heat. It was nothing fancy, but it was exactly what I needed. When I arrived, I parked my car on the gravel driveway, grabbed my backpack, and stepped into the cold air. The trees surrounding the cabin were tall and dense, their bare branches reaching toward a cloudy sky. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful silence you find in nature, but an oppressive stillness, like the world was holding its breath. I shook off the feeling and unlocked the door. Inside, it smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. The place was clean, with just enough furniture to make it cozy. A worn couch, a small table with 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner. I spent the first evening settling in. I chopped some wood from a small pile outside and got the stove going. The fire crackled warmly, and the glow filled the cabin with a comforting light. I made a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, then sat on the couch with a book. By the time I went to bed, I was already feeling more relaxed. The first night was uneventful. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows now and then, but I slept well. I woke up with the sunrise, the pale light filtering through the thin curtains. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the woods surrounding the cabin. The forest was dense, with a mix of evergreens and bare oaks. The ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves, damp and slippery. I didn't stray too far, just enough to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. I found a small stream about half a mile from the cabin and followed it for a bit before heading back. When I returned, I noticed something odd. The pile of firewood I'd been using was scattered. The logs were no longer stacked neatly but were spread out across the ground. I frowned, thinking maybe the wind had knocked them over. But as I picked them up, I realized they weren't just knocked over. They'd been moved. Some were several feet away from the pile, and there were no drag marks or signs of animals. I tried not to overthink it. Maybe I'd left them like that and didn't remember. I res-tacked the wood and went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, things started to feel off. I had finished dinner and was reading by the fire when I heard something outside. It was a faint noise at first, like twigs snapping. I brushed it off as animals moving through the forest, but then the sounds grew louder, footsteps crunching in the leaves. I froze, listening. The steps stopped just outside the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door. It was locked, but the thought of someone being out there made my skin crawl. Minutes passed in silence. I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window, but there was nothing there, just the dark woods and the faint glow of the moon. I told myself it was my imagination playing tricks on me and went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the ground outside the cabin near the firewood pile were footprints. They were large, much larger than mine, and they led from the edge of the woods to the cabin and back again. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. Someone had been here last night, walking around while I was inside. The thought made my stomach churn. I considered packing up and leaving, but I told myself it was probably just a hunter or a hiker passing through. Maybe they'd seen the cabin and gotten curious. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the day inside, keeping the doors locked and the curtains drawn. The silence outside was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling. That night, the noises returned. It started with the footsteps again, circling the cabin. Then came the scratching. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the walls, but it grew louder and more deliberate. I sat on the couch, clutching the flashlight I'd brought with me. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the room. The scratching moved around the cabin, from one wall to the next, like someone was testing the structure. I wanted to call for help, but my phone had no signal, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I was completely alone. The scratching stopped suddenly, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the doorknob rattled. My heart stopped. I stared at the door, barely breathing. The rattling grew more forceful, like someone was trying to break in. I grabbed the fire poker from beside the stove and stood frozen, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped. The footsteps retreated into the woods, and everything went quiet again. When I stepped outside the next morning, I found more footprints around the cabin, but these were different. They weren't just outside the door. They were around every window, as if someone had been looking in. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things as quickly as I could and threw them into the car. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. In the woods, just beyond the tree line, a figure stood watching me. They were tall and unmoving, dressed in dark clothes that blended with the shadows. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were staring directly at me. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I floored the gas pedal and didn't look back. Even now, months later, I can't explain what happened. I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they found nothing. No signs of anyone living in the woods. No evidence of a crime. The cabin owner claimed he'd never had issues with trespassers before. I've tried to move on, but the memory haunts me. Every time I'm alone in a quiet place, I hear the footsteps, the scratching, the rattling of the doorknob. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that cabin again. I don't know why I decided to go. Maybe it was the boredom that came with being stuck in my small apartment in Chicago, or the thrill of seeing something I wasn't supposed to. I'd seen the photos online. A crumbling cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, abandoned for years. No official records about who owned it, why it was left behind, or even when it was built. The only information I had was from an old Reddit thread where some urban explorers mentioned its location. They warned against going. That should have been enough for me. I took off on a Friday morning, packed light. Just some snacks, a flashlight, a portable charger, and a few tools for navigating the woods. I told my boss I'd be working remotely, but I didn't plan on checking my emails. The drive to the small town nearest the cabin took 8 hours. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, and the cold December air nipped at my face as I filled up my gas tank. The attendant didn't say much when I asked for directions to the woods near Eagle's Ridge. He just gave me a tight smile, shrugged, and said, "People don't go out there much." The GPS on my phone stopped working halfway down the narrow dirt road leading to the area. I parked my car where the road ended, a dead end flanked by dense trees. I checked my gear one last time and started walking. The air was still and quiet, except for the occasional rustling of branches as a breeze swept through. The snow on the ground was thin, just enough to crunch under my boots. I followed the rough directions I'd scribbled in my notebook. Go straight past the old marker stone. Turn left when the trees thin out. Keep going until you see the clearing. It was supposed to take an hour, maybe two. But the deeper I went, the more I lost track of time. The forest seemed endless, and the overcast sky didn't give me any clues about the sun's position. Every step felt heavier as I pushed through underbrush and stepped over fallen logs. Finally, I saw it. The cabin looked even worse than the pictures. Its roof sagged, and the wood siding was warped and rotting. The front door hung off one hinge, swaying slightly as if it might fall off at any moment. The windows were shattered, leaving jagged edges like broken teeth. Surrounding it was a field of tall, dead grass that hadn't been touched in years. I hesitated for a moment. There was a heaviness in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. But curiosity pushed me forward. I crossed the clearing and stepped onto the cabin's creaking porch. My flashlight flickered as I swept it over the door. Deep gouges marked the wood, almost like claw marks. I dismissed it as weather damage and went inside. The interior was worse. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in thick clusters from the ceiling. The smell of mildew was overpowering. I stepped carefully, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The main room had a few pieces of furniture: a rotting couch, a broken table, and an old wood-burning stove. A staircase led to a loft above, and a single door in the back probably led to a bedroom or storage. I spent the next hour exploring, snapping photos on my phone, and rummaging through the junk left behind. There were old magazines from the 70s, rusted tools, and empty jars. Nothing unusual. But then I found the trapdoor. It was in the corner of the main room, hidden under a faded rug. The edges were nailed down, but the nails were loose enough that I pried them out with my multi-tool. When I lifted the door, the smell hit me first, something foul and metallic. I gagged and pulled my scarf over my nose before shining my flashlight into the darkness below. A ladder descended into what looked like a cellar. At first, I told myself not to go down there. I'd already seen enough to satisfy my curiosity, and the smell was making my stomach churn. But something about the cellar pulled me in. It wasn't just the mystery. It felt personal, like I needed to know what was down there. The ladder creaked as I climbed down, and I had to move slowly to keep from slipping on the damp wood. The cellar was colder than the cabin above, and the walls were made of rough stone. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing shelves lined with jars of cloudy liquid. A table in the center of the room held tools, knives, saws, and what looked like homemade restraints. My chest tightened as I realized they weren't rusted from age. They were stained with something darker. I backed away, my heart racing. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint but visible in the dirt floor, bare feet, heading deeper into the cellar. My stomach dropped. I followed them cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. The footprints led to another door, smaller and reinforced with metal bands. It was slightly ajar, and the stench coming from beyond it was almost unbearable. I pushed the door open. The room was a nightmare. Bones, human bones, were piled in the corners. Some were old, bleached white with age, while others looked disturbingly fresh. A wooden chair sat in the middle of the room, its arms and legs wrapped in frayed rope. The walls were covered in crude drawings, scratched into the stone with what looked like fingernails. shapes of people, animals, and something else I couldn't quite make out. I turned to leave, but then I heard it. A faint sound, like breathing. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The sound was coming from the far corner of the room, where the shadows were the thickest. My flashlight flickered, but I kept it trained on the spot. Slowly, I saw movement, a figure emerging from the darkness. It was a man, but barely. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes sunken and wild. He wore rags, and his hands were smeared with something dark. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with an expression that made my blood run cold. I turned and ran. I scrambled up the ladder, nearly slipping in my panic. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps uneven but fast. I burst out of the trapdoor and sprinted toward the clearing. The cabin door slammed shut behind me, but I didn't stop to look back. The woods seemed darker now, the trees twisting together like they were trying to trap me. I ran blindly, my lungs burning and my legs aching. The sound of footsteps behind me grew fainter, but I didn't slow down until I saw the faint glimmer of my car in the distance. I jumped into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys before the engine roared to life. I didn't look back as I tore down the dirt road, branches scraping against the sides of the car like claws. It wasn't until I reached the main highway that I let myself breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I didn't stop driving until I was back in Chicago, the city lights washing away the memory of the dark woods. But the memory didn't stay buried. A week later, I found a note slipped under my apartment door. It was a scrap of paper, dirty and torn, with just 2 words scrawled in jagged handwriting: "Found you." It was the middle of August, and I had taken some time off work to explore South America. I wanted to disconnect from my usual life and try something different. The Amazon had always intrigued me, not just for its beauty, but for the challenge it offered. I wasn't the most experienced when it came to the outdoors, but I figured renting a small cabin in the forest for a few days would give me just enough of the wilderness without getting too extreme. I wasn't going on any dangerous treks or deep exploration, just a quiet stay in a cabin off a dirt road near the edge of the rainforest. The locals were friendly enough, though they warned me about the weather. August wasn't the rainy season, but storms could still roll in unexpectedly. I didn't think much of it. I had packed a rain jacket and sturdy boots. When I arrived at the cabin, I was pleased to see how secluded it was. It sat about a mile off the main road, surrounded by dense trees and vines. There was no electricity, but it had a small fireplace, a bed, a table, and enough supplies to last me a week. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, made a small meal, and read a book by lantern light. The forest was alive with sounds: chirping insects, distant calls of birds, and the rustling of leaves. It was calming in a way, even though I was far from home and completely alone. The second day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I didn't go far, just walked in a loop, marking trees with pieces of ribbon so I wouldn't get lost. The rainforest felt overwhelming with its towering trees and endless greenery. The air was thick and humid, and every step seemed to stir some unseen creature. But it was beautiful, and I felt a sense of accomplishment for stepping out of my comfort zone. That night, the rain began. At first, it was light, a soft pattering on the roof of the cabin. But by midnight, it had turned into a full-blown storm. The wind howled through the trees, and rain slammed against the windows. I had trouble sleeping with all the noise, but I wasn't worried. The cabin felt sturdy, and I knew storms like this were common in the region. By the third day, the rain hadn't let up. I stayed inside most of the day, reading and writing in my journal. The air felt cooler, almost damp, inside the cabin. I noticed small leaks in the roof, nothing major, but enough to force me to place a couple of pots and pans to catch the drips. The forest outside looked darker than before, the rain creating a mist that clung to the ground. That evening, I noticed something odd. When I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I saw footprints in the mud near the cabin. They were faint but fresh, leading from the trees to the edge of the porch. At first, I thought they might be mine from earlier, but the size was different, larger. I reasoned it could be a local passing through, maybe a hunter or someone lost. Still, it unsettled me. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to shake off the feeling. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, and the lantern's light flickered as if the wind were trying to force its way in. I told myself I was overthinking things. After all, the Amazon was vast, and people often roamed the forest for various reasons. By the fourth day, I was on edge. The rain had turned the ground into thick mud, making it impossible to go far. The forest seemed quieter than before, the usual calls of animals replaced by the constant drumming of rain. I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. They had been too close to the cabin for comfort. That night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't the rain or the wind, but something else. A faint tapping, almost rhythmic. It came from the back of the cabin, where there were no windows. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound continued for a few minutes before stopping abruptly. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a branch knocking against the wall, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching a heavy flashlight like a weapon. The next morning, I forced myself to go outside and check the area. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, but the ground was still soaked. I found more footprints, these ones clearer than before. They circled the cabin, stopping at the back wall where I had heard the tapping. I debated leaving, but the road back to town was miles away, and the rain had likely made it impassable. I decided to wait one more day. If the weather improved, I'd pack up and head back early. That night was the worst. The tapping returned, louder and more deliberate. It moved along the walls, starting at the back and circling to the front. I didn't dare make a sound. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, listening. Then there was a new noise, a scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It started at the door and moved along the windowsills. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a person? An animal? I couldn't bring myself to look. Hours passed before the sound stopped. When dawn finally broke, I mustered the courage to step outside. The footprints were everywhere, deeper now, as if whoever or whatever had been there had lingered for hours. I didn't waste time. I packed my things, strapped on my boots, and started down the muddy trail toward the main road. The rain had stopped, but the forest felt heavier, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. I didn't look back, not even when I felt the hairs on my neck stand on end, as if someone or something was watching me. It wasn't until I reached the main road and saw a passing truck that I finally felt safe. When I told the locals about what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances but didn't say much. One older man finally spoke, warning me that some areas of the forest were best left alone. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press him. Even now, I can't explain what happened during those nights. Was it a person? An animal? Something else entirely? All I know is that the cabin felt alive in a way that still haunts me. And sometimes, when it rains, I can almost hear the tapping, faint and distant, as if it's calling me back. I grew up in the city, far from the countryside, but every summer, my parents sent me to stay with my grandma on her old farm. It wasn't much of a farm anymore, just a few acres of overgrown fields and a sagging barn. But the cabin she lived in was as old as the hills and carried an air of forgotten times. She lived in a remote part of Michigan, tucked away from the nearest town by miles of dense woods and gravel roads that always felt like they were leading you nowhere. The summer I turned 16, I spent a few weeks there. Grandma was getting older, and she needed someone to help her keep the place from falling apart. It was 1996, and without cell phones or modern distractions, the days felt long, almost timeless. The cabin itself was weathered, with faded red paint peeling off the wood and a tin roof that creaked in the wind. Inside, it smelled like old wood and mothballs. It was cozy, though, and I always felt safe there. At least I used to. That summer, something changed. Something I still have trouble explaining. The cabin sat on the edge of the woods, and beyond it, the land sloped into a wide, marshy area. Grandma always warned me to stay out of the marsh, said it wasn't safe. I never questioned it. The water was black and stagnant, surrounded by tall reeds that swayed in the slightest breeze. Even in the daytime, it had a heavy, eerie feeling. One afternoon, I was cleaning out the barn when I noticed a strange smell. It was faint, like something rotting, but I couldn't find the source. The barn was full of old tools, hay bales, and forgotten junk, so I figured it was a dead animal somewhere. The smell lingered, though, even after I left the barn. It seemed to follow me. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, a rustling sound, like someone walking through the dry grass. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Grandma had told me stories of coyotes and even the occasional black bear in the area, so I wasn't too worried. But the sound didn't go away. It circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, stopping just beneath my window. I didn't dare look. The next day, I decided to explore the marsh despite Grandma's warnings. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. I grabbed a pair of rubber boots from the porch and headed out. The air grew heavy and damp as I approached, and the ground turned soft beneath my feet. As I waded into the reeds, I noticed something strange. The water was unusually still, almost like glass, and there were no signs of life. No frogs, no birds, nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I pressed on. About 50 yards in, I found an old wooden rowboat half sunken in the mud. It looked like it had been there for decades, covered in moss and rot. I couldn't help but wonder who had left it there and why. That's when I saw the footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the mud, but they were unmistakably human. They led from the boat deeper into the marsh, disappearing into the reeds. They didn't look fresh, but they weren't old either. I turned back, suddenly feeling like I was being watched. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than it should have, and every rustle of the reeds made me jump. The smell in the barn grew stronger over the next few days, and I finally decided to find the source. Armed with a flashlight, I started moving things around. It didn't take long to find it. In the far corner, beneath a pile of old tarps, I found the remains of a deer. At least, I think it was a deer. The body was mutilated, almost unrecognizable, and the smell was overwhelming. What struck me most was how clean the cuts were. This wasn't the work of an animal. Someone or something had done this. I buried the remains behind the barn, trying to shake off the unease. That night, the noises outside started again. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. Heavy footsteps, slow and methodical, circled the cabin. I stayed in bed, clutching the flashlight, until the first light of dawn. A few days later, a storm rolled in. The rain was relentless, pounding on the tin roof like a drum. The wind howled through the trees, and the power went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. I lit a few candles and tried to keep myself busy, but the storm felt different, angrier, somehow. Around midnight, I heard a loud bang outside, like something heavy had hit the side of the cabin. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and peered out the window. The rain made it hard to see, but I could just make out a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the wind whipped around it. I froze, unable to look away, until a flash of lightning illuminated the yard. The figure was gone. The next morning, I told Grandma about what I'd seen. She brushed it off, saying the storm had probably played tricks on my eyes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. While she was napping, I decided to explore the cabin more thoroughly. I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe some kind of explanation. In the pantry, hidden beneath a rug, I found a trapdoor. It was small and looked like it hadn't been used in years. I pried it open and shined the flashlight down. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, and the wooden ladder leading down looked like it might collapse under my weight. Still, curiosity got the better of me. The space below was a small root cellar, filled with old jars of preserves and a few rusty tools. But in the corner, I found something that didn't belong. A pile of old, weathered clothes. They were covered in mud and stains I didn't want to think about. And then there was the knife, long, serrated, and rusted. It looked like it had been down there for years. I climbed out of the cellar, my hands shaking. Whatever was going on here, I didn't want to be a part of it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin felt louder, every shadow darker. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the footsteps, but this time they were inside. They moved slowly, deliberately, through the kitchen and into the living room. I held my breath, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out from fear, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The door was open, but there was no sign of anyone or anything inside the cabin. I packed my things and left that day, making up some excuse about needing to get back home early. Years later, I heard a story about a man who used to live in the area. He'd gone missing in the 1970s, leaving behind a string of unexplained murders. They never found his body, just his abandoned car near the marsh. The locals said he knew the woods better than anyone, that he could disappear without a trace. I don't know if it was him I saw that night, or if it was just my imagination, but I've never been back to that cabin. Grandma passed away a few years ago, and the place was sold off to someone else. Sometimes I think about the marsh, the trapdoor, and the figure in the storm. I wonder if whoever owns the cabin now has heard the footsteps too. My cousin James was a biologist, a meticulous one at that. His life revolved around studying insects and their behaviors. He was always traveling to remote locations for his research, and that summer of 2017, he invited me to join him in a cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine. The place was isolated, at least a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. He said he needed help with his research, and since I had nothing better to do, I agreed. At the time, I was 27 and working as a freelance writer. The idea of spending a month in the wilderness sounded like a perfect way to clear my mind while helping James with his work. When I arrived at the cabin, it was as secluded as he described. The nearest neighbor was over 5 miles away, and there was no cell service. The cabin was rustic but well-maintained, with 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a single bathroom. James had already set up his equipment: microscopes, specimen jars, and an assortment of tools for catching and preserving insects. The first few days were uneventful. James was focused on his work, collecting samples from the forest during the day and analyzing them in the evenings. I spent my time hiking, reading, and jotting down notes for potential story ideas. At night, the forest was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or distant hoot of an owl to break the silence. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. One evening, James told me he was heading out to set some traps and wouldn't be back until late. I decided to stay at the cabin and work on my writing. Around 10 p.m., I heard the first unusual sound. It was faint, like the buzzing of a large insect, but it seemed to be coming from inside the cabin. I looked around but couldn't find the source. I chalked it up to my imagination and went back to writing. An hour later, the buzzing returned, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from the kitchen. When I walked in, I noticed a faint vibration coming from the floor. I crouched down and pressed my ear against the wooden planks. The buzzing was coming from beneath the cabin. It wasn't constant but pulsed in intervals like a heartbeat. I tried to convince myself it was just the plumbing or some harmless animal burrowing under the cabin. But deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. When James returned around midnight, I told him about the sound. He seemed intrigued but not overly concerned. He suggested we check it out in the morning. The next day, we crawled under the cabin to investigate. The space was cramped and dark, with barely enough room to move. As we shone our flashlights around, we noticed small holes in the dirt, about the size of a quarter, scattered throughout the area. The buzzing had stopped, and there was no sign of anything unusual. James collected a sample of the soil to analyze later and dismissed the whole thing as probably nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Over the next few days, the buzzing became more frequent and louder. It would start in the evening and continue through the night. I began to notice other strange things, too. The forest felt different, like it was holding its breath. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. And then there were the insects themselves, swarms of tiny, unidentifiable bugs that appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. James was ecstatic. He said he'd never seen anything like it and spent hours documenting his findings. He set up more traps around the cabin and even installed cameras to capture any activity. I tried to share his enthusiasm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like nails on wood, but it grew louder and more frantic. It was coming from the walls. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it around the room, but I didn't see anything. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it had started. I spent the rest of the night sitting in bed, clutching the flashlight and waiting for dawn. The next morning, James found one of his traps destroyed. The metal was bent and twisted, like something had ripped it apart with incredible force. Whatever it was had also left behind strange marks on the ground, patterns that looked almost deliberate, like they had been etched into the dirt. James was fascinated and started to theorize about the possibility of a new, undiscovered species. I wasn't so sure. As the days went on, the activity around the cabin escalated. The buzzing grew so loud it felt like it was vibrating through my skull. The swarms of insects became more aggressive, swarming the cabin and covering the windows in a thick, writhing mass. James was undeterred, but I was terrified. I wanted to leave, but James insisted we stay until he could gather more data. One night, everything came to a head. I woke up to the sound of James yelling. I ran to his room and found him staring out the window, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. He pointed outside, and when I looked, I saw them. Dozens of creatures, insect-like but far too large to be normal, were crawling out of the ground. They had elongated bodies, spindly legs, and translucent wings that shimmered in the moonlight. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. They surrounded the cabin, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. James grabbed his camera and started taking pictures, but I couldn't move. I was frozen with fear, watching as the creatures began to swarm the cabin. They battered against the windows and doors, their buzzing so loud it drowned out everything else. The walls shook, and I could see cracks forming in the wood. I don't remember much of what happened next. Somehow, James and I managed to barricade ourselves in the bathroom. We stayed there until morning, listening as the creatures tore apart the cabin. When the first light of dawn broke, the buzzing stopped. We waited for hours before finally stepping outside. The cabin was in ruins. The walls were splintered, the roof caved in, and all of James's equipment was destroyed. The ground around the cabin was covered in those same strange patterns, etched deeper into the dirt. There was no sign of the creatures. We didn't speak as we packed up what little we could salvage and left. James submitted his findings to several scientific journals, but no one took him seriously. I haven't spoken to him much since that summer, but sometimes, late at night, I hear that buzzing sound in the back of my mind, and I wonder if they're still out there, waiting. Last summer, everything changed. Emily, my wife of 7 years, passed away in a car accident. She was only 34. I was driving. It was my fault. The guilt has been like an anchor ever since, dragging me to places I never thought I'd go. I stopped answering phone calls, ignored my friends, and let my work slip away. Most days, I sat in our small, one-story home staring at the walls, wishing she would walk through the door again. But she wouldn't. I needed space to breathe, to think, or maybe just to escape. That's how I ended up at a remote cabin in the northern woods of Michigan, far from the town we called home. I rented it for a month, figuring the quiet and isolation might help. Maybe it'd give me the clarity I needed. The cabin sat on the edge of a dense forest, miles from the nearest town. It was small, just 2 rooms and a porch overlooking a lake. It was the kind of place Emily would have loved, rustic but comfortable. I told myself it'd be good to feel close to her somehow, even if only through the things she loved. I arrived in mid-October. The air was crisp, and the leaves were a mix of gold and crimson. The drive up was uneventful, just long stretches of empty road cutting through the wilderness. I didn't mind. I wanted to be alone. The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time sitting on the porch, staring at the lake. I'd brought a few of Emily's things with me. A scarf she always wore, her favorite book, and a photo of us from our last vacation. I set them on a small table by the bed, a makeshift shrine. At night, the silence was almost oppressive. The wind would whistle through the trees, and the occasional crack of a branch would snap me out of my thoughts. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the accident in my mind. It was like a movie on a loop, every detail etched into my memory. By the 4th day, I noticed something strange. It started with small things. A chair moved slightly from where I'd left it, the scent of Emily's perfume lingering in the air despite the windows being closed. First, I brushed it off. Grief does strange things to your mind, and I wasn't exactly in the best state. Then, the more tangible things started happening. One morning, I woke up to find the scarf I'd brought draped over the chair by the fireplace. I was sure I'd left it on the table by the bed. The next day, the photo of us had been turned face down. I tried to convince myself I was just forgetful, that I'd moved them without realizing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The woods around the cabin had a strange atmosphere. During the day, they seemed peaceful, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. But as the sun set, that peace turned into something else. The shadows grew longer, and the woods seemed to press in closer. I started hearing noises at night, twigs snapping low, muffled sounds I couldn't quite place. One evening, I decided to go for a walk. The trail behind the cabin wound through the forest and eventually led to a clearing. I thought maybe the exercise would help clear my head. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out, the beam cutting through the growing darkness. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual rustle of animals seemed absent. I kept walking, trying to ignore the unease growing in my chest. The trees loomed overhead, their bare branches like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. I reached the clearing after about 15 minutes. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, and the moon cast an eerie glow. There was something odd about the space. It felt too perfect, too symmetrical, like it didn't belong in the chaos of the forest. As I stood there, I noticed something half buried in the leaves. I crouched down and brushed them aside, revealing a small wooden box. It was old, the wood weathered and cracked. There were no markings, nothing to indicate what it was or why it was there. Curiosity got the better of me. Picked it up and opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a ring, Emily's wedding ring. My stomach dropped. I hadn't brought her ring with me. It was still at home, sitting in a drawer where I'd left it after the accident. I unfolded the paper with trembling hands. Written in Emily's handwriting were 3 words: "Come find me." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the box. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. Couldn't be real. I sprinted back to the cabin, the box clutched tightly in my hands. The forest seemed alive now, branches scratching at me as I ran. The noises were louder. Footsteps behind me, something breathing heavily. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I set the box on the table and stared at it, unsure of what to do. For hours, I sat there, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the box was real, the ring was real, and the note was real. I couldn't deny that. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me jump, and I kept the flashlight by my side. I kept thinking about the note, those 3 words looping in my head like a broken record. The next morning, I decided to leave. Whatever was happening, I didn't want any part of it. I packed my things quickly, throwing them into the car without any care. As I went back inside to grab the last of my stuff, I froze. The photo of us, the one I'd brought, was gone. In its place was another note, written in the same handwriting: "You're not leaving." Panic set in. I grabbed the keys and bolted for the car. As I started the engine, I glanced at the cabin one last time. Standing in the window was a figure, a woman, her face obscured, but her silhouette unmistakable. I drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look back. It's been months since I left that cabin, but I can't escape what happened. Every night I dream of Emily. She's standing in the clearing, holding the wooden box, her eyes filled with something I can't describe. I still hear her voice sometimes, calling me, begging me to come back. And some nights I almost do, but I know if I ever return, I won't leave again.